All right, guys. So our next topic here takes us kind of out of the realm of the movies for a brief second, but it's very, very connected to the movies because there's an interesting article here from The Guardian that was stating that Marvel and DC, like the companies themselves, are in a bit of receiving a bit of a backlash from a lot of comic book creators in general, for the most part. And the reasoning behind it, and this is a really good article, is like pretty insightful. It is fairly long, so I would recommend going through it and kind of getting like more of a deep dive through it because it does cover a lot of information. But the Cliff Note version is essentially that there are these comic creators. So like all these movies, these DC movies and these Marvel movies, they make billions of dollars. And then they take a lot of liberties with the material, but most of it is always sourced from the comics. They use characters that, a comic book writer or, artist created, and then they use them. They might change them up a little bit, but they use that creation made by someone else in their movies and they make billions of dollars. And this article goes into that essentially testimony from a lot of these artists or writers who flat out, like Ed Brubaker, created the Winter Soldier like storyline and everything that you see play out in films. Like that was from his mind, and like you go on and see, but like they're essentially not receiving any of the financial benefits that the studio is
That
getting.
would piss me off so
Yeah,
bad.
so like there's the headline here is that like the thank you note in 5,000. There were multiple sources who stated that like their compensation for the use of their character or whatever from the comics in the big Marvel movie was an invitation to the premiere and a $5,000 check. And that wasn't like an all expenses paid trip to the premiere. Like they would have had to have paid for a plane ticket, paid for a hotel, whatever. It was just here's 5 grand and you can come to the premiere. But you got to pay to get there and all that stuff. So you're pretty much using that 5 grand just to come to the premiere for no reason. And it's like, that's all they got. Like, they go on to make $1 billion with Thanos, but the guy who made Thanos gets a
Gets
$5,000 check.
and a thank you.
Like, and I'm just that was just hyperbole. I don't know if that exact situation happened, but they go on to, like, there's like I said, there's a very in-depth article here, and it does bring up the interesting question though, because even the article goes on to say this is that these artists or writers are hired as like freelance writers, right? So like they go on and it's pay for hire. Like they do the job, they get paid for it. End of story. Marvel owns anything that they do. So, does Marvel or Disney or DC or Warner Brothers have any sort of obligation to pay them more money if it's being used later on?
I would 100% think so, but you'd think they'd have to sign some form of contract for that to happen.
Well, that's the thing. Technically speaking,
If
no.
I made Thanos and they're like, "We're gonna make a movie out of your character," I'd be like, "You're gonna give me like $5 for every time like his name, like just anything."
Well,
Like
that stuff has to be negotiated in the contract, and you got to think here. These
you got to be
people,
smart enough to do
they're
that.
not hired in to make the next big character. Like the Thanos was never imagined to be a big screen villain over a 20 film arc in a movie franchise. Thanos was made to be a villain in comic books,
Right.
and he got paid to write the comic book. End of story. Like Marvel later on in a different landscape decided to, their studio popped off and now they're making all these movies. So they're using their material to make these movies. So it all makes sense. And honestly, as I saw someone else talking about this, and it does kind of more bring up a more of a moral obligation, more so than a contractual obligation, because I would think anymore, you would have to have going into a job here, something like this outlined in your contract ahead of time. And
Yeah,
I
100%.
do think that morally speaking, and the article does say that there is like both Marvel and DC have some sort of outline in each of their contracts that people do receive some sort of compensation if the character is used in some way.
And is
Yeah,
successful
in
or
other properties. Who knows what that is? It's probably different for everybody, and like depends on how big the character gets and whatever. It's going to be unique to each turn, like each character in the end. So it's hard to have some sort of blanket contract made because they don't really know how well it's going to do. So it could get messy, but it does become a just in terms of trying to like have correct numbers messy, not like messy because it'd be bad for one or the other, just difficult to manage for the most part.
Yeah.
It's like with Star Wars, and know that was gonna pop off and be what it is today. You know, just you make a movie, you hope people like it. Like, that's why George Lucas at least had the foresight to retain those goddamn merchandising rights. Like, he was like, "Man, if anything, hopefully this pops off and, like, there'll be a lot of toys." Like, and sure enough, he did, and that was probably the best decision he ever made, was hanging on to those merchandising rights.
Right.
But I mean, that's the situation that you're kind of in. Like, if you're a contractor, you get hired to go build a deck, you built the deck, you're done, you got paid for it. You don't then get like more money each time someone uses the deck and loves the deck. And like, it's you built the deck, you're good, Like if they go on and throw like if a DJ comes out to my house and plays on the deck that the contractor made, the contractor doesn't get a cut of the DJ set.
No,
Like,
because that
you know
was
what I
worked
mean?
out in the
Yeah,
contract.
it's like you were just hired to build the deck, dude. I could do whatever I want with it after that. That's how all of these things usually work in any company. You know what I mean? Like in any job that you get hired to go work for a corporation, anything you do is owned by the corporation. So, I mean, it is difficult though in a creative market like this. Like, especially with the way things are nowadays, I would almost expect that they probably will have to, like, re-outline some contracts when, like, the ultimate goal is to have, like, a movie made at some point that could make billions of dollars. I would feel the moral obligation to kind of compensate people more fairly for it if that were to happen, but you just never know. Like,
Yeah,
you never
it's
know
just
what's
hard to
gonna happen.
say.
'Cause that's like someone who gets hired to write a movie gets paid to write the movie. They don't like 9 times out of 10, I mean, unless they negotiate something within that specific contract, they could negotiate back in points off on, like, that movie, but they know they're making a movie that could make up to X amount of dollars. When you're writing a story for a comic book, you don't know, like, comic books don't really sell that well, so you can't really take back end points off comic book sales.
Right,
So it's kinda hard to say that, like, okay, well, maybe one day this will be in a movie, and maybe that movie will you make $1 billion, so I should get paid more money. Like, that's
right.
not necessarily the case. You don't know if that character ever will make it into a movie. If it does, the movie could suck. Like, you just don't know. It's a tricky situation. John, as someone who reads a lot of comic books and watches a lot of movies, what is your headspace with this? Like, where do you think? Because I definitely I'm on both sides here, and I totally see like while there is no legal obligation for these companies, like these studios, to pay the creators anything, is there a moral obligation to? Do you think something should be outlined in contracts so it's a little bit more concrete that would like because of the climate we're in right now, like if X thing is used, maybe just something written in the contract that explicitly states the contract will be renegotiated for fair compensation if any of your characters are used in a movie that, makes a lot of money or something. You know what I mean? Something that's like vague enough to doesn't lock them into some huge payout, but also written there legally enough to say that there will be a renegotiation of compensation if that were to occur. I think that would be kind of the only way to really do it properly, but I don't know, because then you always have someone coming back like, "Well, you need to give me more, you give me more, you give me more." So it's a tricky situation. What do you think?
Sure. It's hard when you're talking about comics because comics have such a bad history of taking advantage of people to a certain extent. Bill Finger famously is the co-creator of Batman, arguably, the main creator, even
Oh,
though
yeah.
for decades Bob Kane was attributed as the sole creator of Batman. And Bill Kane was famously referred to as anytime a comic book creator got screwed over by a comic book company, they would say he got fingered because
Hmm.
of what happened to Bill Finger and his contributions to Batman. I mean, Bill Finger died penniless and destitute. and the guy created one of arguably the most famous, comic book character of all time. So there's a very bad history when it comes to comics and publishers and them taking care of their creators fairly, even on the low end, just being fair to their creators. Um, so that being said, I feel like, yeah, there's a history there where comic creators, that nobody envisioned that this was going to happen with these characters, and so there weren't things in contracts that laid out how these characters could be used and what kind of monetary payment should be made to creators that created these characters that are now worth so much. Um, that being said, since about the 90s, early 2000s, it's well documented that what had happened in the past, and creators do have the ability now um to have a contract drawn up that more fairly compensate them. And if they don't like the terms, and I think this is a very important distinction. If you don't like the terms that DC or Marvel set forth with you for how your stories are going to be used and how you're going to be compensated, you don't have to work with them. You can go do your own thing and do independent creator comics, which some people do, and they have tremendous success. I mean, Todd McFarlane does Spawn at Image Comics and has created a whole empire off of his Spawn comic books. So you can have a great deal of success on your own. Part of working with DC and Marvel is you get the benefit of working with characters that are established. Even if you create new characters that, you create a new villain for Superman that ends up being like the coolest villain ever, and like his, takes over Lex Luthor as his arch nemesis, for the next 100 years. That's great, but you also got the benefit and the exposure of working with that character, and so not to diminish what your role was in the creation of that character, but anybody that creates things now, you kind of know what the rules are, you know what the framework is, and you know what you're doing. So I have a hard time, especially with anything that's been created in the past 20 or 30 years, feeling like creators are getting quote unquote screwed as far as that goes. I also feel like it's worth pointing out that I hate saying all this because I feel like I'm coming off as a shill for the companies. But I also feel like it's worth pointing out that there are thousands of comics printed every year that writers write that don't go anywhere and don't do anything. There are thousands of characters that are created that are never heard from again. That creators were paid money to create some sort of, addition to this character or this franchise, and it doesn't work out. The writers, whatever the writer comes up with, doesn't connect with the audience in the way they would hope, or the publisher, and those ideas fall by the wayside, and they got compensated for something that ultimately really didn't add any value that the publisher had hired them to add. So it works both ways. The creators still get paid even if the comic flops, but then the creators don't get paid necessarily when it takes off and works gangbusters. I think what you were saying about the moral part of it is ideally how I wish things worked. I wish that Marvel and DC and Warner Brothers would, and Disney, being the parent companies, would look at these situations and go, this writer X did write a story that's very similar that we based our movie around. And this movie made millions of dollars, or $1 billion. We should probably take that into consideration and come up with some sort of fair. But unfortunately, that isn't necessarily the way the world works, and so it's disappointing. But I also think, like, if you're a creator nowadays, if you're some sort of person or an author or a a penciler, an inker, if you're involved in the creation of these things, then you need to make sure that you're covered and that you are covered adequately to what you think you should be covered. I mean, that's the other thing too. Like, I think people sign some of these deals thinking like, oh yeah, that'd be great if this thing took off and made a billion dollars, but I'm happy with this now. But then when you start seeing the actual money, it's like not. Again, I feel like I'm being overly apologetic but it's like somebody that doesn't play the lottery and then their numbers come up and they're like, well, yeah, but I should get that money because I would have played the lottery if I had known, or like, sometimes these things are just a roll of the dice. Like, who knows which story is going to hit and go on to be such a big one. So I don't know. I'm on both sides. I wish the companies were fair about it. I also think I have a hard time with the creatives, especially nowadays, because everybody knows the game at this point.
Yeah, because that's the thing. Most of the time, like it's like an anomaly when something takes off like this. Like no one, if Ed Brubaker was, because that's the thing. Like I think the best example I could come up with, like that was, it's like a screenwriter getting hired to make a movie. They know what they're being hired to do. They're going to be paid fairly to what they think is fair for the job that they're doing. And if it's the kind of movie that could potentially make billions of dollars, and it's in the contract usually to have them get sort of back end points off it. But like unfortunately, maybe nowadays it could be different. And that's kind of like where my headspace is at. It's like, well, nowadays, if someone's coming in to write something for X thing, the potential of it becoming a movie is like more of a real thing than it ever was 20, 30, 40 years ago. So like there's
Yeah.
no way someone doing anything with a comic book could have ever imagined that something they did in a comic book would go on to make a movie and make $1 billion, something like that. There's no way they would have known. Like that, if they knew that was going to happen, they would have had that sort of thing ironed out in their contract. Just like a screenwriter who's going to make a movie knows that this movie has the potential to make X amount of dollars, so their agent's going to have something in there to have them fairly compensated based on the success of that movie. So I think the same thing should happen with comic writers nowadays. Like, have something outlined in there. Just say, if the time ever comes to where something is used of yours in a movie that is like loosely based upon or directly, picked up right off the page, then we will renegotiate some sort of compensation, adequate compensation for that. I think something like that needs to be drawn up. And if I was a like comic creator working today, that's what I would be trying to negotiate with any contract I did for either of these big companies, because like that chance of that happening is real. Like
Yeah.
they're like comic book movies are huge right now. They're looking for any new material to make and anything. Like it is a very high possibility that your work could be adapted if you're writing like the Superman comics. If you're writing the Batman comics, there's a very high likelihood that that stuff could actually go to the screen. But you know that you're being hired in to write Batman. So that sort of contract is the kind of contract where you'd be like, look, if this becomes a movie in any way or my story is adapted in some way, I want a renegotiation of compensation based on how much money that movie makes and if how much of my material is used in that movie, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's the best way to go about it. But yeah, unfortunately, it's just people that happened to like 40, 50 years ago, kind of like they really are just kind of shit out of luck, and it's just shitty. Like at this point, there's really only a moral obligation at that point. Like if someone, if Disney wants to pay X person who wrote X Black Widow thing 30 years ago that they have now adapted, like this is kind of on them if they wanted to do that. But there's definitely not a legal obligation. But I don't know. I would imagine nowadays though it
It,
could be different. Like
it's the whole. I mean, in a way, it's not just an issue with it's not just an issue with comics. It's an issue with it's an age-old problem with
Oh yeah.
a working class and a working class citizenry and those that own the means of production. I mean, we're breaking it down. We're taking it specifically to talk about the comic book industry as a whole, but the workers that develop the newest iPhone apps, or the newest technology that is used in the iPhone, then the iPhone takes off and makes $1 million. Do those workers then shouldn't those workers be given more than what they were just paid to, because it becomes such a bigger success than it ever anybody ever thought it would be? Or just whatever the next new technological breakthrough is, like all the people that put their time and effort into it, they got paid for that work, but shouldn't they be, compensated more? It's and morally, yes, but unfortunately, the way our society is set up, the way the business is set up, like there's not a court that goes in and looks at your contribution to any given thing and says, okay, you contribute the X amount, so you should get X amount of the revenue that comes from it. Just as there's no court that also goes and says, hey, you contribute X amount to this project that failed miserably and lost this much money, so you have to now kick back this much money to your employer because of it. So
Oh yeah.
it's a difficult situation. I see both sides of it, and I'm glad I don't have to make the ultimate decision on it.
Oh yeah, and that's the thing too. Like it's like an impossible thing to predict. Like 'cause
Yeah.
you never know what's going to happen, and it really is no different than is someone working at a gas station chain. They come up with a newfangled idea just to make the store run better, and then like the boss gets a bonus, and like because it was their store and it's doing something better, and it's like, but the guy who came up with the idea, who decided to do it, didn't get the bonus, and it's like, well,
Yeah.
it's just that's how it works. It's not fair, but that unfortunately is exactly how it works. Like it's like you were hired to come in and do your job and you're getting paid. Like if you're not happy with the wages while you're getting like doing the job, then you can leave. Like that's just kind
Mhm.
of how the world works in every line of work, really. It's just again, this is an anomaly where it's $1 billion, a movie kinda thing, so, like, I totally I wouldn't wanna be in either position like you said, in all honesty.
Yeah.
So, Rick, did you have anything you wanna add?
think we covered most of it. I just think that people should work that stuff out in the beginning.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
now at least, people are starting to understand that. So
That's really the only way is, like, this specific situation could be handled. Like I said, in the end, I in today's climate, this could very well be drawn up in contracts when the artists or writers get hired in.
yeah.
They could put some sort of clause in there because the likelihood of this becoming a movie and making $1 billion is a very real thing. So, they could do that. I don't know if they would do it though at the same time. Like, I don't really know because at the same time, Warner Brothers owns the I or DC owns the IP.
Yeah.
It's theirs. Like, and it's like, like John says, like, coming in to working here that you don't own Batman. Like, you get to come in and play in that sandbox, but ultimately you don't own Batman. So it's a tricky situation. It really is. So I'm curious, to see guys, what do you think about this? It's we all kind of think if it's an impossible situation. I do think there's some fair things, quote unquote, morally fair, maybe that you could outline in new contracts, but unfortunately, the way the world works, like anything like from the past is like kind of it's just a tricky conversation. It's a tricky situation rather. Whatever you guys think, let us know down in the comment section below.